Hello, beautiful people. This is Venerable Tech Quang Tree from Dharma Tree, and you're listening to Ask a Monk. So, by the time this recording gets published and available, it's already July, but I wanted to dedicate this episode to answering the question, is being LGBTQ okay in Buddhism? Or what are the views of LGBTQ plus in the Buddhist community? So hopefully this will answer some of those questions and hopefully make people feel a little bit better. We'll see. But every once in a while we do get questions around the point of LGBTQ and how LGBTQ is viewed in the Buddhist community or the religion. And this is one of those questions where the answer is kind of similar, but also maybe a little bit different depending on who and where you ask. I think in the Western societies, LGBTQ plus has been pretty okay in the Buddhist community, especially more recent. There's been a little bit more organizations and groups or centers around LGBTQ friendly practices or sanghas, and I think that's a great thing to have. But as far as what the Buddha taught or the Buddha's view on LGBTQ, and the answer is actually pretty simple. And the answer is that there is no mention of being pro or against LGBTQ whatsoever in any of the Buddhist discourses, which is great because that really just emphasizes that the person practicing Buddhism or trying to attain enlightenment doesn't really matter who or what they are, right? The Buddha was pretty pretty prominent in human rights for his day and age, right? He lived in a community or in a place where Hindu culture was pretty dominant and strong, and there was a caste system, and the caste system was followed pretty strictly. And so it gave a lot of, or I guess it took a lot of human rights, I guess, away from people depending on their class. And even in the higher classes, women, for instance, were still viewed as a kind of sub lower class of even the Brahmin caste system. So the Buddha was really a revolutionary person who, allowed women to ordain as nuns, and he allowed, criminals and just bad people to join his sangha and his monastic community. And so he was really basically open-minded because he knew it doesn't really matter who or what you are, as long as you are able to practice correctly and you give your full effort and diligence into your practice, then that's all that matters, right? Anything else is just extra superficial stuff that doesn't really concern your enlightenment. And so nowadays, it's really not an issue for the most part. There are some views, on LGBTQ depending on the place of where Buddhism is practiced, right? So, for instance, in like Tibet or in Tibetan Buddhism, there are a few rules or perhaps precepts against LGBTQ, but that mainly comes from a societal point, right? It's their society's view on LGBTQ, not necessarily Buddhism. And so, because they want to protect their culture, protect their society, and whatnot, they've added or made some rules or regulations on or around LGBTQ. But in most other places, it's really not an issue, at least not for lay practitioners or lay disciples. In monasticism, on the other hand, it's still not exactly a big deal. Again, during the Buddhist time, it wasn't ever mentioned. You'll never find any discourses that go for or against LGBTQ. Now, there are some translations, and I can't think of the word just yet. I think it's chandalas or chandas, something like that. Anyway, there's a word that is typically translated into English as unmanly men. But if we look at the origin of the word and look at the context of that word that the word is in, it really just means a person who has been castrated, basically a eunuch, right? And so because they've lost their male genitalia, they are seen as unmanly men. And so in modern day, if we were to tell someone, oh, you're very unmanly, that may suggest something not very friendly, I guess. But and so that's really one of the only places in the discourses where we would see that type of vocabulary or word usage. But it doesn't necessarily mean or point to any LGBTQ. It's just referencing a type of person that in the day was seen unmanly because they were eunuchs or they were castrated. Nowadays, at least maybe within the last decade or so, even during monastic ordination, there are some traditions that, well, in all traditions, when you go through ordination process, right, you get asked a set of questions, and you have to, pass all these questions in order to be considered for ordination. And so in the past, one of those questions was asking, if you were gay, or had homosexual tendencies or something like that, and that would have been a reason to disqualify you from ordination, not necessarily because they were against LGBT, but because the monastic sangha were afraid that if there was a gay person among them, that they would try to, seduce the other monks or nuns, or, just do things that are immoral for a monk or a nun. And so that was really the main reason for that inclusion, or that verbiage inclusion in the questioning. However, in recent years, I believe they've, again, depending on the tradition, they've changed kind of the verbiage and just asked and kind of switched it out to if the person was a hermaphrodite or something, or if they were, transitioning or viewed themselves as the opposite sex. So it's still a question, because there has to be a certain number of questions within the ordination process. And so the original question of asking if the person was homosexual is no longer there, for the most part. At least not during my ordinations, it wasn't. But even so, I don't think it's a fair question to ask whether they keep it or not, because if you are true in your intentions and true in your passion to become a monk or a nun, and to practice diligently for the sake of yourself, for other people who want to learn the Dharma or practice the Dharma, I think that kind of identity needs to be dropped regardless, right? Because part of the practice of Buddhism is to drop all these identities or these egos or the titles that we give ourselves, right? And so if you enter monasticism with all the titles that you've had in lay life, right? Like you're a doctor, a lawyer, you're gay or straight, you're a senator, a preacher, whatever it may be. If you take these titles with you into monastic life, then you're really not living a monastic life at all, because you're still carrying with you some of these past titles or obligations you may have had. And so I think it's kind of the same thing, even for a lay person, right? If you're holding on to all these different titles and designations and identities, and then it's just an extra layer of stuff that you have to try to peel away into the practice, right? Because part of the practice is to recognize that there's no self, that there's no me or I or anything like that. And so part of that is to let go of all these identities we give ourselves. I know it's important to some people to have that kind of identity, right? Especially if it's someone who's struggled with their identity, for most of their life or growing up or whatever. And so coming to this kind of realization of this is finally who I am is empowering, but at the same time, it's also unnecessary, at least in the spiritual aspect of things. And so, I think, at least for monastics, on one hand, it's important to let go of these identities, because there are some monastics out there who are LGBTQ or persons in a priest, quote unquote priest position in some of the Zen traditions, where they hang on to their LGBTQ and use that as a platform almost for their teachings or for their agenda. And I don't necessarily agree that this is a good thing, because again, if you're a monastic or someone in clergy, then it's your responsibility to teach the correct Dharma, which is to let go of this idea of non-self or self. It's okay to advocate and to appreciate and to help advocate for these organizations or the LGBTQ movement or anything or any other human right movement. It's okay, right? But I think the identification, or to say this is me or I am this, really defeats part of the purpose of finding the path or living or working on the path. But back to the original question, which again, I went off topic quite a bit. And I know sometimes it's a little controversial to speak about it or to ask about it or anything like that. But it is important to know for the LGBTQ community that it is okay to be part of that community and to be part of the Buddhist community as well. There's no discrimination toward LGBTQ whatsoever. All humans are capable of Buddhahood. All humans and people or beings are capable of attaining enlightenment regardless of their identities or their preferences or anything like that. And so it's hopefully it's good to know, or it'll give people the sigh of relief that it's okay, right? You're not breaking any rules, you're not going against the Buddha taught or anything like that. So you are okay. We are okay. So I hope that answers that question. I do want to say happy Pride for LGBTQ. I know it's past June and I meant to do this sooner, but monastic life isn't always it's time consuming. So finding the time to record this finally opened up. So happy Pride, and may everyone smile and be well. Thank you. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha.